Welcome back. So, today I'll be talking about the enslaved children in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the US during the transatlantic slave trade. My sources will be the narrative of Frederick Douglass, Mintz, a scholar at Columbia University, and the Same Passage website. I'm starting with Frederick Douglass. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father. That means he did not know his father. But of the correctness of this opinion, I know nothing. This means of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. I never saw my mother to know her as such more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times was very short in duration and at night. She was hired by Mr. Stewart, who lived about 12 miles from my home. They didn't have cars back then. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave has special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom get, and one that gives to him that gives it the proud name of being a kind master. I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended what little we could have had while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old, no father, no mother, and on one of my master's farms near Lee Mills. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. No closure, right? She was gone long before I knew anything about it. Never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions as probably felt at the death of a stranger. As to my own treatment while I lived on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, it was very similar to that of the other slave children. So he's talking about when he's a child. I was not old enough to work in the field, and there being little else than field work to do, I had a great deal of leisure time. The most I had to do was to drive up the cows at evening, keep the fowls out of the garden, keep the front yard clean, and run of errands for my old master's daughter, Mrs. Lucretia Auld. That sounds like a lot of work to me. The most of my leisure time I spent in helping Master Daniel Lloyd in finding his birds after he had shot them. My connection with Master Daniel's was one of some advantage to me. He was quite attached to me and was sort of a protector of me. He would not have allowed the older boys to impose upon me, and would divide his cakes with me. I was seldom whipped by my old master, and suffered little from anything else than hunger and cold. These are basic needs: to be warm, to be fed. I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse towel linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. I had no bed. I must have perished with cold, but that the coldest nights I used to steal a bag which was used for carrying corn to the mill. I would crawl into the bag and there sleep on the cold, damp clay floor with my head in and feet out. Remember, he's just a child. My feet has been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I'm writing might be laid in the gashes. We were not regularly allowanced. They were not fed regularly, given rations regularly. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This was called mush. I think it's similar to what we call turn cornmeal in Jamaica, is where you cook cornmeal with water and spice. As the culture evolved, they put more to it, but it was mush. I guess that's it. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs, they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingles, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate fastest got the most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied, so they all left hungry. Or mainly, I was probably between 7 and 8 years old when I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. I left it with joy. I shall never forget the ecstasy with which I received the intelligence that my old master, Anthony, had determined to let me go to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh Auld, brother to my old master's son-in-law, Captain Thomas Auld. I received this information about 3 days before my departure. They were 3 of the happiest days I've ever enjoyed. I spent the most part of these days in the creek, washing off the plantation scruff and preparing myself for my departure. The pride of the parents, which this would indicate, was not my own. I spent the time in washing not so much because I wished to, but because Mrs. Lucretia had told me that I must get all the dead skin off my feet and knees before I go to Baltimore. For the people in Baltimore were very cleanly and would laugh at me if I looked dirty. Besides, she was going to give me a pair of trousers, which I should not put on unless I got the dirt off me. The thought of owning a pair of trousers was great indeed. It was almost a sufficient motive, but only to make me take off, not only to make me take off what would be called the pig drovers, the mange. Yeah, we say that mange word in Jamaica too, but the skin itself. I went at it in good earnest, working for the first time with the hope of reward. The ties that ordinarily bind children to their homes were all suspended in my case. I found no severe trial in my departure. My home was charmless. It was not home to me. On parting from it, I could not feel that I was leaving anything which I could have enjoyed by staying. My mother was dead. My grandmother lived far off, so that I seldom saw her. I had 2 sisters and 1 brother that lived in the same house with me, but the early separation of us from our mother had well nigh blotted the fact of our relationship from our memories, so they were not living like a family. So now that's just one person, so now I'm going to have a more aggregate view, and this is Childhood and Transatlantic Slavery, written by Stephen Mintz of Columbia University. Growth rates among slave children were extremely slow. Most infants were weaned early, within 3 or 4 months of birth, and then fed gruel or porridge made of cornmeal. Around the age of 3, they began to eat vegetable soups, potatoes, molasses, grits, hominy, and cornbread. This diet lacked protein, thiamine, niacin, calcium, magnesium, and vitamin D, and as a result, enslaved children often suffered from night blindness, abdominal swellings, swollen muscles, bowed legs, skin lesions, and convulsions. These apparently stemmed from diseases such as beriberi, pellagra, tetany, rickets, kwashiorkor, diseases that are caused by protein and nutritional deficiencies. Deprived of adequate diet, enslaved children were very small by modern standards. Their average height at age 3 was shorter than 90% of the 20th century American 3-year-olds. This is how impoverished they were. At 17, slave men were shorter than 96% of the present day 17-year-old men, and enslaved women were shorter than 80% of the contemporary women. About half of all the U.S. enslaved children grew up apart from their fathers, either because he lived on another plantation or had been sold away or was white. On large plantation, infants and very young children were supervised and cared for by adults other than their parents. Children as young as 2 or 3 might work at domestic chores, including childcare or collecting trash and kindling, toting water, scaring away birds, weeding, or plucking grub off plants. Generally in the U.S. South, children entered the fieldwork between the ages of 8 and 12. Enslaved children received harsh punishments, not dissimilar from those meted out to adults. They might be whipped or even required to swallow worms they failed to pick off the cotton or tobacco plants. During adolescence, a majority of slave youth were sold or hired away. Survival and resistance. This is from the same passage website. Enslaved children in the U.S. resisted in varied ways. Some, like Frederick Douglass, that is, learned to read in secret, defying laws against literacy. Others ran away or engaged in work slowdown. We call that malingering. Cultural practices such as storytelling and spirituals preserved African heritage and fostered hope. By the Civil War, older children aided Union forces, acted as spies or guides, contributing to emancipation. So they were not just there being acted upon, they had agency and they tried to liberate themselves. Enslaved children in the Caribbean and Brazil. Children as young as 4 or 5 were an integral part of the sugar colonies in the Caribbean. For example, by the late 18th century, children under 15 years old made up 20 to 25% of forced labor. Children were assigned tasks based on age and physical ability. Young children work in grass gangs, weeding fields, or carrying water, while older children, ages 10 through 14, performed more strenuous tasks like cutting cane or tending livestock. Workdays often exceeded 12 hours under harsh tropical conditions, with malnutrition and disease rampant. The mortality rate for enslaved children was staggering. Studies suggest nearly 30 to 50% died before the age of 5 due to overwork, inadequate food, and diseases like dysentery. So yeah, the Caribbean was the capital of the harshest kind of treatment towards enslaved people. And just like in the US, children were separated from their families to maximize profit and to punish resistance. Older children became parentified children who cared for younger ones. Young girls were sexually violated. Now for Brazil. Brazil was the largest importer of enslaved Africans in the Americas. It received 4.8 million captives between the 16th and 19th century. Children were a significant portion of this population, with estimates suggesting 15 to 20% of their arrivals were under 15 years old. Slavery in Brazil was diverse, spanning sugar plantation, coffee estates, urban households, and gold mine, and hence the experiences of the children varied. On rural plantations, children worked similar to those in the Caribbean, tending fields or performing domestic tasks. In urban areas like Rio de Janeiro and Salvador, enslaved children were street vendors, domestic servants, or apprentices in trades like shoemaking. Conditions varied widely. Urban children might have slightly better access to food, but faced constant surveillance and abuse. Plantation children endured grueling labor. For instance, in the 19th century coffee boom, children as young as 8 hauled heavy baskets under threats of whipping. Mortality rates were high, with parish records from Bahia showing children mortality rates of 40% in some areas. Family separation was always there and was there as well. Enslaved children in Brazil resisted through cultural preservation and rebellion. They participated in African-derived religious practices like candomblé, maintaining cultural identity. Older children joined the quilombos, or runaway communities, I know I'm botching those words, such as the Palmares, which thrived in the 17th century. By the 19th century, urban children were involved in abolitionist network, passing messages or aiding runaways. And so that's where we stop. The children were at work. So I carried you through the individual, what Frederick Douglass said, and a more aggregate view, and then I went from a look at the US, then I included the Caribbean and Brazil. I hope it was helpful. Thanks for listening.